You know that feeling, right? You want to get up to speed on something important, maybe for work, maybe just because you're curious. But faced with all the information out there, it feels like trying to climb Mount Fuji in flip-flops.
Yeah, overwhelming.
Exactly. And that's why we're here. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Japan. It's a country with this incredibly long, fascinating history, a real mix of ancient ways and super modern life. We've pulled together a whole range of sources covering, well, everything from prehistory right up to its place in the world today.
Yeah, our material really spans the whole gamut. We're looking at Japan's unique geography, how that shaped things early on, the huge cultural exchanges, those big political shifts.
And how it became such a major global player.
Exactly. I mean, we're talking pottery from thousands of years ago, right up to AI today. It's quite a story.
So our mission here is pretty simple. Pull out the key stuff, the surprising bits, the connections that really light up Japan's story for you.
We want to give you a solid, engaging handle on the big forces, the key moments, without, drowning you in academic speak.
Think of it as your fast track to being genuinely well-informed. Okay, let's start at the beginning. The land itself. It's an archipelago, a chain of islands. That must have been huge.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. Japan's environment is, well, it's pretty distinct. It's mountainous, volcanic islands. So they've always lived with nature's power, lots of earthquakes, typhoons, floods, landslides.
Part of life there.
Right. And being islands is crucial, too. Think about it. In all its long history, Japan's never actually been successfully invaded by an outside force.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal historically. And size-wise, I always hear compared to California. Is that fair?
It's a decent comparison for land area, yeah. But here's the twist. Japan has about 4 times the population of California.
4 times, crammed into the same space.
Pretty much. And those mountains we mentioned, less than 15% of the land is actually good for farming.
So not exactly rolling fields everywhere?
No. And despite maybe some romantic ideas, it wasn't rich in minerals either. But the sea. The sea was everything. An incredible abundance of fish right from the start. That connection to the sea is just core.
Okay, so against that backdrop dynamic, maybe a bit precarious, we get the first human communities.
Yeah.
The Jomon period. Pottery's the big marker there, isn't it?
Spot on. The Jomon period, huge time frame, roughly 14,000 to 300 BCE, defined by hunter-gatherer fishers, and yes, their distinctive pottery.
And this pottery, was it the first in the region?
Well, the very first pottery in East Asia shows up earlier, maybe 29,000 years ago, over on the continent. In Japan, the oldest bits we've found are around 16,500 years old, so a bit later.
Any idea why it popped up later in Japan?
It's interesting. One theory involves the geology. Sources suggest these specific clay sediments, sort of Miocene clays, appeared around then. They were great for pottery.
The right materials became available.
Possibly. And this coincided with a colder climate period, which might have played a role too, maybe affecting migration or just making pottery more feasible or necessary. The materials themselves might have influenced the timing.
Fascinating link. And the Jomon folks, they didn't stay exactly the same for, over 10,000 years? Things must have changed.
Oh, definitely not static. One really interesting shift we see, especially in the middle Jomon, is lots more clamshell bracelets.
Bracelets? What do they tell us?
Archaeologists think this points towards more permanent villages taking shape, people settling down.
Right. Not moving around so much.
Exactly. And when you settle down, maybe you get more reliable food, a surplus, which can then lead to, social competition, status symbols, like maybe those bracelets. It drives cultural change.
Okay, so from settled hunters and fishers, we get this massive shift. Farming arrives. The Yayoi period, that sounds like a game changer.
A huge game changer. Around 300 BCE, the Yayoi period kicks off, and the defining thing is wet rice farming coming over from the Korean peninsula.
Wow, so totally new food source.
And much more. It triggered fundamental changes across the board. The economy, political structure started getting more complex. You see the beginnings of social hierarchy, regional leaders emerging.
And it wasn't just rice, right? Other new stuff came too.
That's right. Metallurgy, working bronze and iron, that arrived in the Yayoi period. New pottery styles too. But what's really key is that this new Yayoi culture didn't just erase the Jomon traditions.
Oh, they mixed.
Yeah, there was interaction, modification. Bits of Jomon culture carried on, influenced Yayoi life in different ways.
A blending, not a replacement. That happens a lot in history, doesn't it?
It really does. And we actually find artifacts suggesting early Korea-Japan contact and trade then. Like Southeast Asian patterns on yayo pots probably came via Korea.
Interesting.
This period also fits with the idea that modern Japanese people have sort of a dual ancestry from the original Jomon people and then these later arrivals from the continent.
Okay, foundations laid. Then fast forward a bit. Around the 6th century AD, this huge wave of influence comes from China. This feels like a really pivotal moment.
Absolutely transformative. Yeah, starting around the 6th century, China's cultural impact was just immense. Not just a trickle, a real flood. Writing systems, political ideas, metalworking, silk production.
And Japan actively sought this out.
Very actively. They sent official embassies, student monks, scholars over to Sui and Tang, China to learn, to bring things back.
You can just imagine the buzz.
Yeah.
All this new knowledge pouring in. But it couldn't have been simple just adopting everything.
Yeah.
Must have caused ripples.
Oh, definitely not simple. It created internal tensions. You had the established ways, Shinto beliefs, bumping up against these new imports, especially Buddhism.
Old versus new.
Pretty much. Even things we take for granted, like written texts, Chinese books were seen as incredibly powerful, almost magical things. There was real debate. How much do we take on? How does it fit with who we are?
This intense borrowing phase leads into the Asuka period. What's the vibe of that era?
Asuka period, roughly 7th century, is really defined by actively grappling with and adapting all this continental culture. Immigrants, many from Korea, brought skills, arts, scholarship.
A real melting pot.
In a way, yeah. The political center, Asuka, saw lots of building temples, palaces, mixing local and foreign styles. Schools popped up, teaching Chinese learning. But interestingly, they also built capitals based on Chinese models, but with, serious defensive walls and moats.
So, open to ideas, but also keeping defenses up. A balancing act. This flows into the Nara period, which sounds like they went even more all in on the Chinese model.
That's a good way to put it. Nara period, 710 to 794, that's Japan really trying to fully absorb and implement Chinese systems, government, civilization, customs, crafts. They went big.
And we know a lot about this period.
We do, because they started writing history down in a big way, consciously imitating Chinese chronicles. Works like the Nihon Shoki, Nihonji, lots of records.
And internally, they weren't just copying, they were making big changes too. Something called the Taika Edicts.
Yes, exactly. The Taika Edicts in 646 were huge, major political and tax reforms. The idea was, theoretically, all land belonged to the emperor. They set up a new administration modeled on China's provinces, officials.
Centralizing power.
That was the goal. And this new land distribution system, the 8-legged lobed field system, aiming for a Tang China-style centralized state. Ironically, though, these reforms, while Chinese-inspired, kind of set the stage long-term for Japanese feudalism later on. Power started to drift locally.
Even the best-laid plans.
Yeah.
So after all this intense Chinese focus, Japan starts finding its own voice, its own identity, in the Heian period.
Precisely. Heian period, 794 to 1185. This is where Japan really starts developing its distinct cultural flavor. Chinese influence doesn't vanish, but it fades back. Native culture, Shinto, clan structures, the imperial family, these become more central.
And the capital moved then, right?
Yeah, to Heian-kyo, which is modern Kyoto, and the imperial court there became the center of incredible cultural flourishing, a golden age for the aristocracy.
And culturally, what stands out? I know some famous literature comes from this time.
Yes, huge literary developments. At first, writing in classical Chinese was still seen as the highest form, the most prestigious.
The Japanese people.
Yeah, even in the court. But then uniquely Japanese forms start bubbling up, like zuhitsu, sort of informal essays, personal reflections.
More intimate.
Exactly. And then the big one, Genji Monogatari, the tale of Genji, early 11th century, often called the world's first novel.
Really?
Many argue that. It's this incredibly sophisticated story about court life, love affairs, complex psychology, all written in the Japanese vernacular of the time, a massive step away from purely Chinese models.
Wow. A real shift to homegrown culture. Okay, but this refined Heian court world doesn't last forever. Things get more military. Feudal Japan and the samurai emerge. What marks that change?
Yeah, the transition is gradual, but the usual starting point for feudal Japan is 1185. That's when Minamoto no Yoritomo becomes the first shogun, sets up the Kamakura Bakufu, basically, a military government.
So the emperor's still there, but...
The emperor's still there, nominally the top. But the real power shifts decisively to the military class, the samurai. This kicks off what we often call the Age of the Samurai.
And this new warrior government got tested pretty early on, didn't it? The Mongol invasions are famous.
Yes. Big test. Late 13th century, Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor of China, tries to invade Japan twice. 1274, 1281. Huge fleets.
But they failed.
Famously failed. Both times, massive typhoons wrecked the Mongol fleets. The Japanese saw this as divine protection.
The kamikaze.
Exactly, the divine one. Huge psychological impact. It massively boosted belief in the emperor's divine status, especially among the samurai who fought. It also shook things up internally. Some new families gained power from the defense effort, even if they weren't traditional players.
The divine wind. Potent symbol. Okay, backtrack slightly. The Kamakura period, this first military government, what defined it?
Kamakura period runs until 1333. Really formative for the samurai and the whole shogunate system. It came after a lot of fighting between powerful families, the age of the samurai, you could call it.
So the Bakufu in 1185 just formalized the samurai's power.
Essentially, yes. It created this hereditary military government that lasted in different forms for centuries. The imperial court still existed, had prestige, but the Bakufu held the reins. It's interesting, Japanese feudalism compared to Europe. Those noble houses in Japan had organized armies quite early on. Think of Taira Kiyomori, Minamoto Yoritomo, big clashes.
And Yoritomo, setting up his rule, how did he handle the emperor? Did he just ignore him?
No, he was clever. Very strategic. He didn't abolish the court or its laws. He governed through his new Bakufu structure, kind of behind the scenes. He created this, well, maybe a three-tiered system. Emperor court at the top symbolically, then the shogun and warrior nobles with the actual power than everyone else. It gave him legitimacy but kept military control firm.
Smart.
Yeah.
Okay, after Kamakura comes the Muromachi period, more of the same military rule.
It's a continuation of military rule, yes, but a new shogunal family takes over the Ashikaga. They set up their Bakufu in Kyoto, hence sometimes called the Muromachi Bakufu.
And it's this period. More stable.
It had its rough patches, definitely. The Onin War was a big destabilizing conflict. But overall, especially later on, it saw a real flourishing of specifically samurai culture. No theater really developed then, ink painting, the tea ceremony became highly refined.
So culture thriving even under military government. But this period eventually breaks down into chaos, right? The Sengoku period, warring states, sounds brutal.
It was mid-15th to early 17th century, just constant, intense conflict. The central government lost control, and provincial lords, the daimyo, fought each other relentlessly for land and power.
Hopefully for all.
Pretty much. You even had groups like the Iko-Iki leagues of armed commoners and monks joining the fray. It wasn't just clan versus clan like Hojo versus Mori. Society itself was in turmoil. Sadly, even the last Jomon groups up in Hokkaido got caught up in the violence.
But out of this chaos, Japan gets unified. Three big names always come up: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu. What were their roles, briefly?
Right, the three unifiers. Nobunaga started it. Really innovative general, challenged the powerful Buddhist monasteries, made huge progress, got assassinated, though.
Didn't finish the job.
No. Hideyoshi, who came from absolutely nothing, a peasant, picked up the pieces, brilliant strategist, controlled most of Japan, got ambitious, tried to invade Korea, failed, died.
So close, but no cigar.
Exactly. Then comes Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was patient, politically savvy, played the long game, won the decisive battle of Sekigahara in 1600, wiped out his rivals, and established a new, lasting military government. That kicks off the Edo period.
The Edo period, famous for peace, stability, and isolation, right?
Yeah.
How did that seclusion shape things?
Yes, the Tokugawa shogunate brought over 2 centuries of peace, but a key part of that was the Sakoku, the closed country policy, very limited foreign contact.
Did that stifle things?
Externally, yes. But internally, it fostered this amazing development of domestic culture and economy. Edo, future Tokyo, just exploded into this massive city, the center of everything. Mass communication, like woodblock prints, flourished. A really vibrant urban culture grew up.
Got an example of that dynamism?
Yeah, there's a story about a place called Nozumiya. Used to be poor, then transformed into this incredibly busy fish market with systems for distributing live fish around the city. Shows sophisticated internal trade.
Wow. Okay, and the government itself, the Tokugawa shogunate, how did it keep control for so long?
It was a very rigid hierarchical system. The shogun at the top, backed by his samurai vassals and a bureaucracy, mostly samurai too. The country was divided into domains ruled by daimyo lords.
But weren't some lords more trusted than others?
Exactly. They were categorized. Shinpan, related to the Tokugawa, Fudai, loyal allies from before Sekigahara, and Tozama, the outer lords, former rivals, kept on a tighter leash. This whole intricate system of checks, balances, and the isolation policy kept the peace for ages.
Until it didn't.
Right. Eventually, internal pressures, economic changes, social shifts, and external pressure from Western powers forced Japan to open up. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigned in 1867. End of an era.
And even during that long peace, culture kept changing. It wasn't just samurai stuff.
No, absolutely not. The merchant class in the cities became really influential culturally, even if they were officially lower status than samurai. City life got more comfortable, focused on arts, entertainment, aesthetics, new forms popped up.
But the samurai still held the power.
Officially, yes. But the lines blurred, especially later on. Samurai got involved in local administration, merchants gained economic power. The social structure got pretty strained by the end, especially with the population growth and eventually the ports reopening. Local governance also shifted more towards joint administration involving local samurai and wealthy commoners, not just direct rule from Edo.
Which brings us crashing into the modern era, the Meiji Restoration. After 1868. Sounds like whiplash after centuries of seclusion.
It's total whiplash, a truly revolutionary time. The Meiji Restoration was this massive top-down drive to modernize and westernize Japan like yesterday.
Why the sudden urgency?
Commodore Perry. The American warships sailing into Edo Bay in 1853. It was a shock, showing just how far behind Japan was technologically and militarily compared to the West. The fear of being colonized like parts of China was real. So the Tokugawa shogunate fell, and the emperor was put back symbolically at the center.
And the changes were everywhere.
Absolutely everywhere. Land reform, industry, finance, politics, military, education, transport, even the language, social customs. Radical, sweeping reforms across the board. The goal was catch up, build a strong nation, resist the West.
Borrowing heavily from the West.
Initially, yes. They sent missions abroad, brought in foreign advisors, adopted Western models for almost everything. It created a strong sense of national unity, eventually, but also involved suppressing dissent for the sake of national strength.
And the emperor's role in all this, he wasn't actually running things day to day, right?
No, the power was with a group of oligarchs, reformers from powerful domains. But they built up the emperor's image massively, used Confucian ideas of loyalty, emphasized the ancient, unbroken imperial line.
Made him a unifying symbol.
A sacred symbol, the foundation of the state. They promoted Shinto as a kind of state ideology focused on emperor worship. This was drilled into people through the new national education system for decades. Very powerful.
Okay, so massive, rapid modernization. Then we get the Taisho period. Sounds like maybe things calmed down a bit. Taisho democracy.
Somewhat. The Taisho period, starts 1912, did see more movement towards democracy domestically. Political parties gained influence, and Japan was definitely a rising world power, especially after siding with the Allies and winning in World War I.
So on the up and up.
Yes, but there were tensions. At the Treaty of Versailles after WWI, Japan felt snubbed. They didn't get all the territories they wanted, like Shandong in China. This built resentment towards the West. So while there was democracy at home, foreign policy got more assertive, maybe even aggressive. Setting the stage for darker times. The Showa period. Militarism, war, destruction. But then rebirth.
Yeah, the Showa period, Emperor Hirohito's reign, covers this incredibly tumultuous stretch. Rising militarism, nationalism, invasion of China, Pearl Harbor, World War II, utter devastation.
Civil liberties must have suffered.
Crushed during the war years. But then, defeat, Allied occupation, and a complete transformation. Post-war Japan embraces democracy, pacifism in its constitution, huge social and economic reforms. Though even in the pre-war militaristic phase, there were always dissenting voices, artists, writers pushing back, often at great risk.
And after the war, this famous economic miracle happens in the 60s. How did they pull that off?
It was remarkable. A real national focus on rebuilding and growth. Things like a strong emphasis on education, creating a highly skilled workforce. The Ministry of Education was very powerful, plus a societal respect for business and engineering.
No anti-business sentiment. Not in the same way as some other places. Combine that with smart industrial policies, focusing on exports, access to markets. It just took off. Japan became an economic giant incredibly quickly.
But that hypergrowth couldn't last forever. And Japan's role kept changing.
Right. By the 70s and 80s, they faced more competition from neighbors like South Korea, Taiwan. Japan also pivoted, became a huge provider of foreign aid, often linking it to promoting democracy and good governance.
In dealing with its own past.
That became complex. In the 80s and 90s, there was sometimes a tendency to downplay the imperial militarist past, trying to find a new normal on the world stage. By the end of the Cold War, it was the world's #2 economy. Today, its global position is, well, it's established. Strong ties to the US and Europe, more complicated relationships in East Asia, a bit of a unique position.
And through all this, Japanese culture, technology, they've had a massive global reach, haven't they?
Absolutely huge. Think haiku poetry. It has this long, rich history figures like Kudobu Daishi, then Matsuobashi refining it. It captured the imagination of Western poets like Ezra Pound. Big influence.
And music.
Instruments like the shamisen found audiences in the West, and then technology.
Yeah.
After WWII, Japan became this innovation powerhouse.
TVs, Walkmans, video games.
Video recorders, semiconductors, you name it. Just look at patent data submitted to the US. For decades, Japan was right at the forefront across so many fields. Initially, a lot of public R&D funding helped. Later, it became more linked to venture capital. A very distinct scientific and innovative tradition, often hard for others to copy directly.
Okay. So we've gone from volcanic islands and ancient pottery to global tech leadership, an incredible sweep of history. Any final thoughts on this journey?
It really is an amazing arc. You see Japan starting out defined by its geography, then periods of absorbing outside culture intensely, developing its own unique warrior class, closing itself off, then this explosive modernization, landing it as a major global force.
And here's something to chew on. Thinking about that whole story, the island reality, those cycles of reaching out and pulling back, how much does that still shape Japan's sense of itself, its way of engaging with the world?
Yeah, that's the provocative question, isn't it? Even with globalization, does that deep history of being an island, of cultural borrowing and isolation, still color how Japan operates today?
It makes you wonder, how do those experiences continue to play out in our super-connected world? What parts of this history jumped out at you? What might you want to dig into more? Something to think about.